All right, Brooks. What was the purpose in building these mounds, and how were these mounds and other mounds created there on LSU's campus?
Well, there are two mounds on LSU's campus, and the first one they started building it, and we think they were building it basically as cremation mounds. And the reason we think that is because we find these microscopic bone fragments that are mammal bone fragments within the ash beds that we see at the bottom of the mounds, at the base of the mounds. And these osteons, these bone fragments that make up you, make up me, our bones, those basically were, if you will, released as a result of the burning. These are, as I said, microscopic. And the plants that they used were reed and cane plants. And of course, reed and cane plants burn very, very hot. We know they're reed and cane plants because they create within themselves something called phytoliths, and they are SiO2, that's their chemistry, essentially little quartz crystals that are unique in terms of their appearance under the microscope. You can identify what plants the phytoliths come from. And so we know these were reed and cane plants, and we know that contained within the ash beds are these microscopic fragments of mammal bone. And so, and because the fires are so hot, they wouldn't have used them as cooking fires. So we're assuming that, or our interpretation is that these were cremation sites, and that they, it could have been a major chieftain that had passed away or had been killed by, in combat. We don't have any idea. This would be just complete conjecture. But at any rate, it could have been a person that was important and that they wanted to cremate. Now we know today humans still do cremations, and some people their wife or husband passes away, or the grandfather, and sometimes they have them cremated and then they put them in a jar and then they put them on the mantle. Well, in this case, if this is what happened, and I say it's an if because we don't know this for sure, but if it is what happened, well, those mounds were their little cremation jar.
Very fascinating. And so, to back up from our little mishap from earlier, just to make sure, um, is there a link between the builders of these mounds on LSU campus and the Native American Indians?
Well, the indigenous peoples, and I use that term because those were the folks that were here, and so it is really unknown and the reason it's unknown is because we have asked permission to do DNA measurements on the osteons, these bone fragments, and that has been denied by Native American groups. In other words, we are not allowed to do a DNA analysis, and therefore we do not know what the relationship would be from these osteons that we see in the mounds to Native American groups that are present today.
If I had to guess, I'm sure there is a link somehow. I wouldn't, because obviously we aren't the first here in North America, but so how far, or I guess, were these mounds constructed before, during, or right after the last ice age, Brooks?
The mounds were right after the last major ice age, at the end of what we refer to as Younger Dryas.
So with these, I guess, is there, when it comes to the builders of the mounds, is there, or do we know? I may have to ask you maybe to speculate a little bit, but with with your research and other colleagues out there, what happened to these to the builders of these mounds?
We don't have a clue. We do not know. And the reason, of course, is in part because we don't know who these these people were. They were people that were here, clearly.
Mm-hmm.
This wasn't an elephant that was building the mounds. So the people were here. And the question is, what is their relationship to other people in North America? And the answer lies in the ability to do DNA.
Yes, exactly.
That's the only way we would ever know.
And what fascinates me, Brooks, is there's of course the infamous, I believe it's in Ohio, the Great Serpent Mound there in Ohio. It's not very tall, but it says it's 1,348 feet long. I I want to say there's you said that there's mounds all over Louisiana and Mississippi. I've seen them. I've lived here all my life in Louisiana, North Louisiana. I have seen them, and I've seen them really. I with my last job traveling all over the United States, I've seen them all over the United States. Do you think there is a possible connection with maybe the mounds there in LSU's campus and possibly the Serpent Mound there in Ohio and other mounds across the United States?
Well, there are a couple of types of mounds that were built by indigenous folks, and many of these are shell mounds. For example, Effigy Mounds National Monument, which is up in Iowa on the west bank of the river, they're built in the shape of animals, like you're talking about Serpent Mound.
Mm-hmm.
And they're built in the shape of animals, and they're built from shell material. And along the east coast of North America, in Canaveral National Seashore, for example, there remains one mound that was also built from shells. So this is a long way from over in Iowa, and these were built by shells, and only two of those mounds remain. The rest, or three actually, the rest have been destroyed. They were all shell mounds, and they destroyed them to use them for road metal. But Castle Windy is one of those that's still there. And when you climb up on top of Castle Windy, this is this shell mound I'm talking about, you can see the Atlantic Ocean from there, but you can also see up there is a barrier island along the eastern seaboard in certain places, a barrier island that is people have their cottages on it, and some houses that are permanent and that sort of thing. And then behind that, there's a river, the Halifax River in Florida, in this area that we're talking about. And that river flows along. So you can, from the top of that mound, you could see other folks who were in canoes moving down the river, for example, and there was an inlet just north of there, an inlet from the ocean into the behind the barrier island, so that ocean water would flow through that area. And so those could have simply been just lookout posts that they built. But there are just so many different cultures in this country that with so many different things that they left behind, and some of these were very old and others are much, much younger. But nevertheless, it's pretty fascinating, and it's hard to disentangle, if you will.
It is very fascinating, Brooks, and this is all over my search, my news feeds, and I'm sure other people that will be watching this will have seen it also. But Live Science, very popular website, oldest human-made structure in the Americas, is older than the Egyptian pyramids. The grass-covered mounds represent 11,000 years of human history. Have you and other of your colleagues, Brooks, have y'all gotten any blowback? Because, like, are there other professors or researchers or other people in the academic field that is giving y'all a hard time with this new discovery there on LSU's campus with these mounds?
And there are some folks that that aren't pleased with it.
Is it
And,
because
and
it pushes? My thing is with this, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Brooks. With my thing is with that, it may, if more discovery and if we eventually get the DNA analysis like you was talking about earlier, if we get that and we start researching more into this, Brooks, it could possibly have to maybe rewrite certain history books, maybe.
yeah, well, the dates, if the dates are believed, and we have quite a number of dates, and they're quite linear. And the paper that we are referring to as the Mounds paper was published on Friday. It was published by the American Journal of Science, which is published by Yale University. And so the our data, our interpretations, everything is in that paper. And that paper is now out there for everyone to look at and to evaluate and to, if you will, approach us and make an argument that they think uh, shows that we were wrong. But in any case, we have quite a number of dates that are all much, much older than what we know for uh, edifices like this.
Now, I was just wondering if you had any other colleagues and friends in the academic world that maybe they look into possibly ancient indigenous Native American, maybe mythology. And just wondering, is there any other written or oral traditional evidence that could give us a better understanding of the motives of the ancient indigenous people who built these mounds?
I do not know if I do not know of that.
Because I know a lot of mythology is just like it is mythology, but a lot of this possibly could have been lost over time. A lot of this, the true history of these mounds and other strange artifacts in North America and really around the world. Um, I know some mythology they do have bits and pieces of truth. I was just wondering that might be something that would be really interesting is to see maybe a mythologist or whoever studies that type of things. I'm sure there's people there in LSU's campus also that do that too. But that'd be interesting to see what they may have, if there's anything that correlate with these mounds, and maybe even though that's not 100% factual evidence, but maybe that will correlate certain findings in the future. Brooks.
Yeah, there really isn't um, anything that I'm aware of where my colleagues have information along those lines. The the only thing that kind of relates to sort of, if you will, modern things that tell us something about the folks that were using the mounds or building the mounds is the fact that they aligned the crests of the A mound and the B mound such that if you take an Adelaide, if you take a device and look at the just a compass, if you will, and draw a tape, pull a tape between the crests of the two mounds, and you measure the orientation of the crests, it turns out that the crests of our mounds, that is the LSU mounds, are about 8 to 8.5 degrees aligned east of north. And the crests of these mounds were completed about 6,000 years ago. Now, there was another pair, and this is also in the manuscript that came out on Friday, that was published Friday. There was another pair of mounds called the Monticello mounds, which were on the same side of the river, on the east side of the river, more or less where the 190 bridge is located that comes across the river. And these two mounds, a mound pair, the alignment of the crests of those two mounds at about 6,000 years ago was about 8 to 8.5 degrees east of north. And it turns out that in the sky about 6,000 years ago, there was a red star called Arcturus. And that was in the sky, and the alignment is about 8 degrees east of north. And
That
so
is fascinating.
we think that they actually built the crests of both of those mound pairs. Now, the ones in at the Monsanto, they've been destroyed relatively recently, but the LSU campus ones are still here, and the orientation is about the same. And the astronomers tell us, and one of the astronomers is an author on the paper, they tell us that that alignment was basically at Arcturus. And so it really does suggest that they were working as a community, and they were looking at the sky. And you figure that anybody living without electricity would look at the sky a lot because it's so beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
But when it's dark. But at any rate, so we think that this is pretty inducive of the fact that they were working together. They clearly had some interest in things that were going on around them.
I think a lot of the ancient indigenous people here, and really our ancient ancestors in general, Brooks, I don't think they get the credit that they deserve. A lot of people just look at these people as dumb hunter gatherers. That is far from the truth. Yeah, they may not have had the technology that we have today, but especially when it comes to the stars and learning how to work as a community, learning how to build certain tools, everything led up to this point in modern day. What's your thoughts on that, Brooks?
These were human beings. They were smart, just like we're smart.
Mm-hmm.
They have the ability to think, just like we do. I mean, uh, some of them will be smarter than others. Some of them will be genius level people, and it's ridiculous to assume that other human groups are different from, don't have the ability to be intelligent. In my view,
Yep.
that's kind of a crazy outlook to have.
So to round things up, I have a few other questions that they're related to your field. Well, first, before I get on to that, so what's coming forward um in the near future with more discoveries, more research with these mounds, and maybe other things that you may be looking into, Brooks?
Basically, we've finished our Mounds work, and
Okay.
that culminated in the manuscript that was submitted and accepted, and now has been published by the American Journal of Science.
Awesome. So have with I just wondering, since you're a geologist and you've been looking at this stuff for years, have you ever looked into a lot of people don't know about this, Brooks, to the vast amount of canal systems all over the United States, especially here where we live in the Delta regions. Um have you ever looked into the vast amount of canals all over the United States and here, and is there any detail on how these canal systems might have been built? Because there's really not a whole lot of explanation that I've heard of.
Yeah, not my expertise, but it is interesting to see that these mounds were built by folks, and they're pretty significant structures. Imagine doing that. In other words, getting together with some of your buddies and building a mound the size of those mounds. And of course, it took them a long time. So the answer is, man is pretty capable of a lot of stuff.
Hmm. Have you ever looked into um, some of these ancient, I wouldn't say ancient, but the large skeletal remains in the United States with any of your research or anything in your field of geology? Which I know it's not technically, that's more archaeology, but I was wondering, have you or any colleagues heard anything about that?
About the
Like large skeletal remains. Some people say like um there's been findings of like really large human or ancient indigenous people that were possibly here. I don't know if it's a hoax, conspiracy, or what, but that some of our ancient ancestors here, or maybe the ancient indigenous people here in North America, they were really tall in stature.
I have no idea. And so, I can't answer that. I'm
Yeah,
not an anthropologist. I'm a geophysicist, basically. And um, geophysics allows me to look inside stuff, but uh, we don't look at at skeletal material or whatever. If we find it in any kind of work that we're doing, we do report it to the anthropologists.
all right, Brooks. Well, this was very fascinating. Um, hopefully, hopefully soon, one day, we can get that DNA analysis that you were talking about, and maybe there will be another paper coming forward. And I hope more we can get more information and detail when it comes to these mounds, because there's not a whole lot out there, and I just hope that maybe just incrementally over time we can get bits and pieces of how this and how the mounds were maybe built back then, or the ancient indigenous people that lived here and how they got here. And to me, it's just very fascinating, Brooks. And that's why I want to have you on and just pick your brain just a little bit, and to just try to get to the bottom of this and try to maybe spread the word as much as I can.
Well, it is the Native American folks that are blocking doing DNA, so you have to convince them, and then we can look at the really, really old DNA and see how it relates to modern cultures. I might mention, if you have a moment, if you
Sure,
don't,
go ahead, Brooks. No, I'm in no rush. If there's something else you want to cover, we can cover it.
one of the things we have done is we've identified that there are some lead and chrome anomalies in some of the samples that, in other words, we've done like chemical analysis, elemental analysis, and there are what is turns out to be paint pigment. Uh, in other words, the lead and a mixture of lead and other material, other elements, basically end up as a paint. And there is a spot in the mound core that we've analyzed that shows a rather interesting anomaly, a lead anomaly. And lead is used as paint, and it could be, and we hypothesize that they may have been wearing some clothing. It could have been leather, could have been something else that was painted, um, was yellow. You can produce yellow paint from the elemental constituents that we look
Hmm.
at. You can do other kinds of paint. And there is a spike in one of these samples that we have that this area was incinerated, and it could have been that they threw a coat that was painted into the fire, or it could have been that someone was cremated who was wearing clothing of some sort. It could be leather or whatever that was actually painted with uh, colored paint to, you know, enliven the clothing that they were wearing.
That's fascinating. So there is evidence. You think that they were using paint that had lead in it?
Yeah.
It's kind of dangerous, but
Well, you
I
wouldn't know you wouldn't know about that, you know.
yeah. Is there anything else that you may want to touch on that we may have left out? We still have a few more minutes. If there's anything else, Brooks,
You
related
know,
to these mounds, to
that's the thing that the paint pigment thing is was kind of interesting.
it is interesting.
We have not published that. I have shown that diagram when I do presentations, but and we haven't really looked into it in at any length. But it is we do know that there were uh, lead trinkets that are known from some Native American sites, and but in these sites, of course, the dates are much older, and so that's interesting and suggests that maybe way back then they were actually coloring their clothing, and that in this particular case, if that individual was cremated, who was wearing the colored clothing, or
Mm-hmm.
if it was if the clothing was just burned, that would have been it, it shows up in the chemistry of the samples.
That's very fascinating. And how and I would love to hear more about that. And maybe I'll have you on more later down the road to just maybe we can discuss more of the findings. But how do you feel being on the cusp of this, um, dating back to 11,000 years ago? How does it feel to be? I guess I'm sure you have other colleagues, but you're basically, I guess, somewhat the spokesperson with this.
Well, there are a number of authors that on the paper that was submitted and has been published now, and of course there are a lot of folks that are unhappy with um, much of what we have done, and so there's an upside and a downside, if you will, to this kind of work.
Why is that, Brooks? Because I look into a lot of topics, and ancient mysteries is really one of mine. Why is there like this infighting whenever somebody comes up with like some type of some new paper, or some new study, some evidence? Why is there always blowback from other academics? And is it because maybe other academics, professors, and everybody else out there, scientists, is it because they're afraid that maybe some of their work and research is it's basically void, or it may counteract, or it may hurt maybe their reputation with other things they have looked into, researched, and studied?
I, I can't can't speak for why there's blowback in these cases, other
I just
than
I was just curious because I'm not a professor and I'm not a scientist. I was just curious, and you're kind of a lot of people in that field, and I can only speculate. I was just wondering, do you see a lot of that in your field?
well, an individual gets up at let's say at a scientific meeting and gives a result that is very different from what um, is the established norm, then uh, there's always blowback and testing of it. And ultimately, the end result is that either it is shown to be incorrect or it is shown to be correct. And the problem with dealing with very old materials is that it's very difficult to get additional samples that are going to give you a similar result. And we know, for example, that the two mounds were built essentially at different times. The southern mound was built first, not totally, but the internal part of it, that call it the internal part. And then uh, it was abandoned, and then they came back and built the other mound, and they built it from different stuff. The B mound was built from the Loess Plateau material, and the A mound was built from the floodplain material. Very different sediment, and so the end result is you've got these two differences that you have to explain, and people um, that don't work with materials like this sometimes will have an argument against this blowback. But the big one, of course, is the date. The dates
Hmm.
are much older than anything else, and therefore it can't be right. At least in some minds, even though we have this trend of dates that's a linear trend, and we've shown this from other archaeological sites in which we've worked, and that where you have these linear trends and then you've got anomalies associated with it, as long as that linear trends is within the range of what folks are familiar with, then that's okay. But if that linear trend, even though it's well defined, is way too old, then of course it's got to be wrong.
Yep. I wish there were more open-minded academics out there. And I guess in the back of my mind, I'm thinking there's professors, other people, and scientists, and people in the academic world. It's like they want to be on the cusp of that. They want to come across some discovery, and it's like it's almost like they get jealous. Maybe that's just my point of view, and or like you just said, a lot of them they don't. There's no way, because that counteracts things that I've looked into. There's no way that ancient indigenous people here in Americas built these mounds 11,000 years ago. There's no way. That I feel like there needs to be a little bit. I'm not saying so open where your mind falls out, but a little bit more mindedness when it comes to looking into these things, and try to when you're looking into especially ancient past, try to not have pre-made I don't know, pre-made assumptions. Follow where the research and evidence leads you, instead of just, you know what I'm saying, Brooks?
Yeah, I do. And in the academic area, of course, in order to do the work we do, we have to get funding for it. In other words, you can't just go out there and do your thing.
Yep.
And we need permission and all of that. And so there's a whole level of bureaucracy that you have to deal with when, but it is important that that's in place because it keeps things steady state, if you will, and prevents people from doing stuff that would be outrageous. And there are all kinds of reasons why people get upset about it, in part because um, they they don't have that information. There's nothing like it. These dates are way too old, for example. And and we have tried to establish by doing many many dates, and we've spent 31 dates. These are carbon 14 dates from those two mounds, and that that is a huge amount of money, and you have to generate funding, sources of funding for that. You have to submit proposals to do this and then get the funding to do it and so forth. And everybody in our business, in order to do stuff, like for example, if you want to work we were working in a cave in Albania, and where we had wood cooking fires, and it's a good example where we can make a comparison between a wood cooking fire versus a very hot fire like the reed and cane, and also looking at linear trends. We have linear trends at both sides, but then you tend to get some deviation, and so you need to explain all of that, and you need to have data to develop and show that what you're seeing is a reasonable, and therefore your interpretation is a reasonable interpretation. And science works that way. It's a matter of constant testing. And so that's as it should be. In other words, it needs to be challenged, it needs to be tested. You need to look at the data and see whether or not that really is showing what you're saying it's showing. And so that's the way science works.
Exactly. Well said, Brooks. When it comes to the funding, I feel like a lot of academics, scientists, professors, but I feel like a lot of people, when it comes to their funding, they're afraid to step outside the box and go and follow the research, maybe wherever it leads, because maybe just like you said, a lot of people feel like they may lose their funding. And that's been talks for a long time. And do certain, I guess, academics out there, are they following a certain, I don't know how to say it, a certain agenda by certain people that are pushing the funding?
it it's up to the individual and their we have sources, for example, the National Science Foundation, and there are sources of funding proposals that you would submit to federal government or to agencies that provide funding, that sort of thing. And it's a difficult. You've heard the expression "publish or perish,"
Hmm.
and so you have to be able to publish. But in order to publish, you have to get funding to be able to do that stuff. And if you need equipment, for example, you need to actually buy the equipment, or in some cases, in our lab, we had a very, very sensitive instrument built by a guy, and it cost us a lot of money to have it done. So that then we could use that instrument in interpreting, measuring samples and then interpreting the data. And so all of that it's a very, very difficult process. And sometimes it takes a lot of time, a long time. And so you have to uh, take off your hat to anyone who wants to do this because it really is a grind, and it's very difficult. And um, therefore you tend to be wedded to your interpretations and what you think the answer is to the question that's being asked, and then the data that are developed.
In your years in the academic world, what are some of your more fascinating, um, I guess, travels all in here in the Americas or all over the world, Brooks?
Yeah, I've traveled all over the world. My major professor, I did my master's and PhD at the University of Rhode Island Graduate School of Oceanography, and that meant my major professor was a seagoer, and that meant, and so we would take piston cores out of the ocean bottom all over the world, and so I had to go on all these cruises, and I like to tell my wife that I've fed the fish in every ocean, and you understand what I'm saying. But at any rate, that part of it is, I mean, you're out there, you're acquiring the data, but in order to get there, you have to have the funding. And in my case, as an undergraduate and then a graduate student, the funding came from my major professor. And so he was generating the National Science Foundation funding for these processes. And then also in my side of it, I like to work on land, and so we've traveled to a number of different locations where we're working. Africa, there are a lot of good sites that we've worked on. And I mentioned the site in Albania, for example. And these are, there are a lot of, I've worked a lot in Vietnam, uh, and currently am doing research in Vietnam. And I did that because I was asked by the National Academy of Sciences to give some talks to Chinese faculty members in Wuhan, and they were they brought a number of people, the professors from all over China, to lectures that the National Academy of Sciences paid me to go and give at there in the city of Wuhan, and most Americans are now familiar with that town.
Mhm.
But at any rate, I decided to try to give payback, if you will, for what I consider to be a really bad thing that the United States did, which was to send troops to Vietnam and get in a war there. And our, my brother, one of my brothers, and my wife's brother is dead because of the Vietnam conflict. And so I contacted some Vietnamese, and this was many years ago, and I I said I'd like to do research there, and I convinced them, and so I went and started working first in the northern part of the country, out near Hanoi. But there's also some great outcrops on which we're working even today, and I'm still working there and periodically, and some of my go back and do collect additional samples. And we've been publishing uh, some of the work from Vietnam. I've been working there since 1990,
Wow.
and this for me is a payback. In other words, it's been helping them, and I've tried to give back something that our country took away.
I
But at any
agree.
rate,
I agree.
so that's
I agree.
sounds like a
I'm very when people think you talk about things like that, they think you're unpatriotic. Far from the truth. I'm very patriotic. That's the reason why I served. But I believe that war was really useless.
yeah. I was
Um,
I tried to enlist when I was so I tried to like you. I tried to serve when I ran out of money my freshman year in college, and they rejected me because I played college football and college soccer, and they rejected me because I had some pretty serious injuries as a result of that. But then later on, when I had gotten, I took a job as a VW mechanic, and I worked as a VW mechanic in the East Coast and the West Coast of North America, or the United States, and I was able to build up enough money to start again. So I applied to school and had been accepted, and I had uh, met a girl, and I was in the process of I asked her to marry me, and they drafted me.
wow.
They wouldn't
she
take me when I wanted to go in, but they drafted me, and because I had been a VW mechanic, they drafted me as a tactical wheel vehicle mechanic, big trucks, big vehicles. And similar thing happened to my dad. He was a motorcycle mechanic during World War II, and they drafted him, and he became a mechanic on a Sherman tank. And he was actually at the Battle of the Bulge.
wow.
And he had a kid, and he was drafted, and a lot of people were drafted. But he was a motorcycle mechanic, and they drafted him to be a tank mechanic. You get the idea. I was a
Hmm.
VW mechanic, and
How'd your wife
so
like that?
pardon me.
How'd your wife like that?
Well, actually, they sent me to Germany, and she loved that because I joined. Uh, we were sitting in a Schloss outside in Ludwigsburg in Germany,
Hmm.
and my wife and I and another guy who was in the army with me, and we were sitting there, and this German approached, and he spoke English very well, and he said, "You guys look like maybe you could play soccer. We're looking for soccer players." You know, and we both said we he had played for he had played for the Sixth Army in the United States before they sent him there, and I had played in college, and so we said, yeah, sure, we can play, and they said okay, and we became players on a a a soccer team. It was the it's in German you call it a Fußballmannschaft, and so we were. It
Say that
was
three
this.
times fast.
It was the anyway. So we played for the this. They were at the a German place in Egglesheim, and it was a small club that they were out of, and the Sechsenvierzig uh, Fußballmannschaft was the. But anyway, so we actually went all over Europe playing in soccer matches,
Wow.
and it was wonderful. I'd
That's
take a
pretty
three
awesome.
day 3 day pass. When you're in the army, you could get a pass, a relief
Hmm.
time, and I'd put in for it. I'd find out when the next match, in France would be or whatever. And so it was
How
kind of
did
a
y'all
neat.
do? How did y'all do against these Europeans?
Oh well, there were only two of us that were Americans on the team.
Oh,
All the
okay.
rest were Europeans.
I got you.
And actually, I was the goalie, and we won most of our matches. And
You
the other guy, the other American, he was just brilliant, just a gifted soccer player, and he was a striker. And he was just, oh wow, he was just superstar.
I think the World Cup is coming to Dallas. Am I right in a few years?
I don't know. I don't
I
pay
I
attention to it
I don't
anymore.
either, but I believe it. I think it's coming to Dallas. But you mentioned a while ago before we end our discussion, you did a little bit of work in Africa, correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Is there any geological evidence or anything else, Brooks, that possibly could that leads to that the out of Africa theory? Is there have you looked into that, or have you is there any evidence?
That's not geological.
I was
And
just
what
wondering
I
if there was any like tools or like I don't know anything if anything that maybe you looked into.
right, and the answer is I wasn't doing that when I was in North Africa and in South Africa, and I was working there for. We were working in some caves and collecting samples and doing the kinds of things that I still do. And in North Africa, primarily on the Moroccan side, if you will, but a little bit of work in Egypt and that area and in the kind of the central part of North Africa. But all of that was really geophysics
I got
and
you.
had nothing to do with anthropology at that time.
Brooks, this was very fascinating. It's really crazy that Louisiana is actually getting some is all over the news right now.
Yeah,
It's we're finally getting something here in Louisiana, so it's very fascinating, Brooks.
yeah,
Um,
it's exciting.
but
It's
yeah,
exciting.
it
Yeah,
is, and hopefully you might get on some other some big time interviews. So be checking your emails. You never know.
yeah. You never know. There you go.
But Brooks, it was a treat, honor, privilege, my friend, and we'll definitely keep in touch and I wish you all the best with other uh research and things you do in the future.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, Brooks, you have a good evening or a good day and maybe I'll have you back on the show down the road.
Okay.
All
Take
right.
care.
You
We'll
too.
see you.
Bye.